The wind off the high pasture came down cold that afternoon, and the woman standing at the edge of the long porch did not flinch when the gust pulled at the loose hem of her dress and laid the dust of 3 counties against her skin. She had walked the last 6 miles with a carpet bag in one hand and a kettle she would not leave behind in the other, and her boots were split at the seam, and her hair had come loose from its pins somewhere outside the second creek crossing. And still she stood with her chin level and her eyes steady on the front door of the Caldwell place, as if she were arriving at a meeting she had set for herself a long time ago. The men at the corral had stopped working when they saw her. One of them laughed. Another spit into the dirt and shook his head and said something low and ugly to the man beside him, and the woman, whose name was Wren Halloran, heard the word plain as a struck bell, and didn't turn her head. She had been called worse. She had been called it by better men and by worse, and she had learned the trick of letting the word pass through her like weather. What she did instead was set the kettle down on the porch boards with the particular care of a person who owned almost nothing, square her shoulders, and knock 3 times on a door that, by every sensible measure, had no reason at all to open for her. It opened anyway, and the man who stood on the other side of it, tall and weather-burned and quiet in the eyes, looked at her the way a man looks at a horse he is trying to understand before he names it, and said nothing for a long beat, and then stepped aside to let her in. If something in that already moved you, do me the small favor of subscribing and staying with me all the way to the end of this one, because I promise you the whole story matters. And tell me in the comments what city or town you're watching from, because I want to see how far the story of Wren Halloran travels tonight. Now let me take you back, because nothing about that porch made sense without the road that brought her to it. And the road that brought her to it began on a different porch entirely, 400 miles east, in a town that had decided what she was worth before she was old enough to argue. She had been born in a back room above a laundry, to a mother who washed other people's linens for 2 cents a pound and never quite washed the smell of lye off her own hands, and a father who had been a name on a paper and a face she would not have recognized if he had passed her on the street. The town was called Ember Hollow, and it was the sort of place that liked its verdicts handed down early and kept on file. By the time Wren was 9, she had been told, in one form or another, that she was plain, that she was odd, that she was too tall, that her eyes were the wrong color of gray, that her mouth set itself in a line that made people uncomfortable, and that she ought to be grateful for whatever scraps of attention came her way, because nothing about her recommended more. She filed each verdict away the way she filed everything she wasn't ready to look at yet, in a quiet room behind her ribs, and she went on with the business of being alive. What the town did not know, because the town did not look, was that the girl who scrubbed floors at the boarding house after school had a pair of hands that could do almost anything they were asked. By 11, she was mending boots better than the cobbler. By 13, she was reshoeing the boarding house's old mule because the farrier wouldn't come out for less than $1 and the boarding house couldn't spare it. By 15, she could set a broken finger, deliver a calf, read a sky for weather 2 days out, and bake a loaf of bread that the cook downstairs would slice up and sell as her own without a flicker of shame. Wren learned early that competence was a kind of secret. People who thought you had nothing did not watch what you did with your hands, and so your hands were free. Her mother died the winter Wren turned 17, coughed out the last of her thin life on a mattress that smelled of lye and lavender, and the funeral was attended by 3 people and the rain. The boarding-house keeper, a thick-shouldered woman named Maeve, who had a soft spot she would not have admitted to under torture, let Wren keep the room for 2 weeks, at no rent, and then handed her an envelope with $11 in it, and said, gentle as Maeve ever was, that the room would be needed and that Wren ought to think about going somewhere her face wasn't already known. Wren had nodded, because nodding was what she did when she was trying not to cry, and that night she had laid out on the narrow bed everything she owned, which came to a change of clothes, a Bible she did not read, a tin box of her mother's hairpins, a folding knife with a bone handle that had belonged to a grandfather she had never met, and a kettle. The kettle was the thing she would not part with. Her mother had bought it the year Wren was born, with money saved from the laundry, and had told her once, in a fever of pride that was rare and brief, that a woman who owned her own kettle could make her own tea anywhere in the world, and therefore was never wholly without a home. Wren had not understood it then. She understood it now. She packed the carpet bag, took the kettle by its handle, walked to the depot before dawn, and bought a ticket west to the end of the line with 7 of her $11. The train carried her 4 days through country that flattened and then rose and then opened into a sky so wide she had to keep looking away from it, because it made her dizzy. At the end of the line, she got off in a town called Bell Creek, and from Bell Creek she walked, because the stage cost more than she had left, and because walking was a thing she had always been good at, and because the man at the depot had told her, when she asked the way to the Caldwell Ranch, that it was a fool's errand, and she might as well start now if she meant to get there before her boots wore through. She had not told the man at the depot why she was going. She had not told anyone. The letter folded into the inside pocket of her dress was 3 months old and had been written in a careful, sloping hand by a woman named Eliza Caldwell, who had been her mother's cousin, twice removed, and who had written once a year to Ember Hollow on cheap paper, and had, in her last letter, said that if anything ever happened, Wren was welcome at the ranch, for as long as she needed, and that there was honest work for honest hands. Eliza Caldwell had died 6 weeks before Wren's mother. Wren had not known until she got to Bell Creek and asked, and the woman at the general store had crossed herself and said the Lord rest her, and Wren had nodded the way she nodded when she was trying not to cry, and had walked out of the store and stood for a moment in the middle of the street and considered, with a clarity that surprised her, that she had nowhere on earth to be. She had decided then to go anyway, not because she expected welcome. She expected nothing. She had expected nothing her whole life and had never been disappointed. She went because the only address she had in the world was on that envelope, and a person needs an address, even a wrong one, to keep her feet moving. So she walked the 6 miles, and she stood on the porch, and she knocked, and the door opened, and the man on the other side of it was not the man she had pictured. She had pictured an old uncle, grey and tired and possibly kind. The man who looked down at her was perhaps 30, perhaps a little more, broad through the shoulders in a way that suggested actual work rather than the appearance of it, with a jaw shaved that morning and a faint scar through his left eyebrow that lifted the eyebrow permanently into a question. His eyes were the colour of creek water in shadow, and they took her in the way good eyes take in a thing, top to bottom and back again, and they registered the split boots, and the dust on her hem, and the kettle on the porch boards, and the carpet bag at her feet, and the steady, unflinching line of her mouth, and they did not laugh. That, more than anything, was what she noticed first. He did not laugh. He stepped aside. He said, "Come in out of the wind," and his voice was low and unhurried, and gave away nothing. She came in. The house was bigger inside than it had looked from the road, with a long room down the middle, and a stone hearth at one end, and a kitchen at the other, and a staircase running up the back wall to a landing she could not see. The floors were wood, scarred and clean. There were no curtains. There were no flowers. There was a coat on a peg, and a hat on the coat, and a rifle above the door, and the air smelled of coffee and wood smoke and the cold edge of something baking. He shut the door behind her and stood with his hand on the latch a moment, as if he were deciding something, and then he turned and walked past her to the kitchen end of the room and poured coffee from a pot on the stove into a tin cup and brought it back and put it in her hand. She had not been offered coffee in a long time. She had been offered the dregs of coffee, the second pour. The cup someone else had not finished. She had not been handed a fresh cup with steam still coming off it by a man who did not know her name. She wrapped both her cold hands around the tin and felt the heat travel up her wrists and into the rest of her, and she did not say thank you because she did not trust her voice, and he did not seem to need her to. He waited until she had taken a sip, and then he said, "You'll be the Halloran girl." She blinked at him over the rim of the cup. He said, "Eliza wrote about you. She said you might come. She said if you did, I was to feed you and not ask questions for the first day." Wren looked at him over the cup, and she felt something move in her chest that she did not have a name for, and she said, in a voice that came out steadier than she expected, "My name is Wren." He said, "Caleb Caldwell." He did not put out his hand. He nodded once, as if a thing had been settled, and he turned back to the kitchen and lifted the lid off a pot and stirred it, and the smell of stew came up and filled the room. He said over his shoulder, "You can sit, or you can stand. The room's the same either way." She sat. She sat on the bench by the long table, and she set the tin cup down in front of her, and she folded her hands in her lap because she did not know what else to do with them, and she watched the back of him while he worked, and she let her shoulders, for the first time in 3 weeks, drop the half-inch they had been holding. The first night she slept in a small room off the kitchen that had been Eliza's sewing room, and still had a basket of unfinished mending under the window, and she slept the way a person sleeps when she has finally set down a weight she did not know she was carrying, deep and dark and without dreams, and when she woke before dawn, it was because she had heard the back door close, and a man's boots on the porch, and then on the frozen ground. She lay still a moment, listening. Then she got up, dressed in the dark, pinned her hair, and went to find work. Because work was the only currency she had, and she meant to spend it before anyone could decide she was not worth feeding. By the time Caleb came back in from the barn, she had the stove going, the coffee on, the kettle she had carried 400 miles filled and singing, a pan of biscuits in the oven, and the kitchen floor swept of the 4 days of mud he had not gotten around to. He stopped in the doorway with his hat in his hand, and he looked at the room, and he looked at her, and he did not say anything for a long moment. And then he said, "The stove draw's crooked. The biscuits will burn on the left side." She said, "I turned the pan at 4 minutes." He said, "Oh." He hung his hat on the peg. He washed his hands at the basin. He sat down at the table. She put a plate in front of him. He ate. He did not speak again until the plate was clean, and then he said, "There's a man named Hollis comes around once a week to ask if I'll sell. I won't. He might be by today. If he is, don't answer the door. I'll get it." She said, "All right." He said, "And one more thing." Wren waited. He said, "The men at the corral yesterday, what they called you. They won't call you that again." She looked at him. She had not expected him to have heard it. She had not expected him to mention it if he had. She had braced herself in the dim hours of the night for the slow education of being called it again and again by men who worked for him and saw no reason to stop. She said, carefully, "It doesn't bother me." He said, "It bothers me." And that was the end of it. He stood up, put his plate in the basin, took his hat off the peg, and went back out into the cold blue beginning of the day. And she stood in the warm kitchen, with her hands on the edge of the table, and felt something in her chest that she had been trained out of years ago try, very tentatively, to come back to life. She put it down. She had work to do. The ranch, she learned over the next several days, was in trouble. Not the loud kind of trouble that announces itself, but the slow kind, the kind that shows up in a fence line that has been mended 3 times in the same place, in a stack of bills tucked behind the flour tin, in the way a man rides out at first light and does not come back until full dark and still does not get to the end of the list. Caleb Caldwell did not complain. He did not, so far as she could tell, complain about anything. But she had eyes, and she had been raised in the school of noticing what people did not say, and by the end of her first week, she had a fair map of the place in her head, and a fair idea of what was wrong with it. The herd was smaller than the pasture could carry, which meant he had sold off, recently and hard. The bunkhouse held 4 hands where the bunks were built for 8, which meant he had let men go. The roof of the main barn had a sag on the east side that would not last another heavy snow. The well at the south pasture was running thin, and the trough beside it had a slow leak that someone had patched with rag and tar instead of replacing. And every Thursday, like clockwork, a polished black buggy came up the long road from town, and a man in a clean coat got out, and Caleb met him on the porch and spoke with him for exactly the length of time it took to refuse him, and the buggy turned around and went back down the road, and Caleb came inside and did not eat for an hour. The man in the buggy was Hollis Marin. He owned the bank in Bell Creek, 2 of the 3 stores, the freight company, and a piece of every other operation in the county that had ever needed a loan it could not quite repay, which was most of them. He had been trying to buy the Caldwell Ranch for 2 years. He had offered, the first year, what he called a fair price, and what Caleb called an insult. He had offered, the second year, less, because by then he had arranged matters so that the ranch was worth less on paper, and he had explained, with the patience of a man who knew time was on his side, that Caleb would come around. Caleb had not come around. Wren learned all of this in pieces, from Caleb's silences, from the old hand named Tobias, who had worked the place since before Caleb was born, and who had taken, after the first 3 days, to drinking his morning coffee at her kitchen table and telling her, in the slow drawl of a man who had decided she was worth talking to, what she needed to know. Tobias was 60 if he was a day, with a face like a dried apple and a pair of pale blue eyes that had seen more weather than most courthouses, and on the 4th morning he set his cup down and said, "You're not what we expected. You know that." She said, "What did you expect?" He said, "Eliza wrote about a little cousin, and we pictured a little cousin." She said, "I'm 22. He said, "You're a grown woman doing the work of 3, and Caleb's noticed, and you ought to know he's noticed, because he won't say." She said, "I don't need him to say." Tobias studied her over his cup. He said, "No, I don't reckon you do. But he ought to, anyway." The first time she perceived the real problem on the ranch was the second Thursday after her arrival, when Hollis Marin's buggy came up the road, and Hollis Marin got out, and Caleb met him on the porch, and Wren, who had been told to stay out of sight, watched through the kitchen window and saw something she was not meant to see. She saw Hollis Marin, while Caleb was speaking, take a step to the right and glance, with the casual eye of a man who has already done it 100 times, at the porch post where the porch met the railing. She saw his hand brush, very lightly, the head of a nail that did not quite sit flush. She saw him smile, a small private smile that was not for Caleb, and she saw, when he climbed back into the buggy, that he gave a particular small nod to a man on horseback who had ridden up behind him and waited at the bottom of the steps. The man on horseback nodded back. The buggy rolled away. The man on horseback rode off in the other direction toward the south pasture, and Wren, who had been holding a dish towel without realizing it, set the dish towel down on the counter and walked to the porch and looked, when Caleb had gone back inside, at the nail in the porch post. It was not a nail. It was the head of a nail. The shank had been cut off. It had been pressed into a hole drilled for the purpose, and the hole, when she worked the head out with the tip of her folding knife, went clean through the post, and inside the hole there was a small folded square of paper, and on the paper, in pencil, in a hand that was not Caleb's and was not Tobias's, and was not any of the 4 hands she had met, there were 3 numbers and a letter. She did not understand the numbers and the letter. Not yet. She put the paper back. She pressed the nail head back into the hole. She went inside. She did not tell Caleb. She filed it away the way she filed everything she wasn't ready to look at yet, and she went on with supper. And that night, lying in the narrow bed in the sewing room, she stared at the dark ceiling and turned the 3 numbers and the letter over in her mind until sleep took her, and she dreamed of a porch post with 100 nails in it, each one hiding a different message, and a man with a polished black buggy reading every one of them like a book. The 3rd week she fixed the trough. She did it on a Sunday afternoon, when Caleb had ridden out with 2 of the hands to look at a stretch of fence, and Tobias had taken the wagon to town for flour, and the bunkhouse was empty, and the south pasture was hers alone, except for the cattle. She had walked down with a hammer, a length of new strap iron she had pried off the broken edge of an old plough that nobody was going to use again, a tin of solder she had found in Eliza's sewing basket of all places, and the small portable forge that lived in the corner of the smithy shed, and that nobody, so far as she could tell, had lit in months. She lit it. She heated the iron. She cut and bent and hammered a proper patch, hot-set it into the leak, sealed the edges with solder, and let the trough fill from the well while she sat on the rim and watched the water rise, and the patch hold, and not so much as a bead of damp come through. She had not done it for praise. She had done it because the trough had been leaking, and the leak had been wasting water, and the well was already running thin, and there was no sense in any of it, and a thing that had no sense in it could not be allowed to stand if she had hands, and the hands had time. When Caleb rode back at dusk and saw the trough full, and the patch dark and neat against the old iron, he reined in the horse, and sat looking at it for a long minute, and then he rode up to the house, and came in through the kitchen door, and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand, and said, "The trough." She was kneading bread. She did not look up. She said, "It needed doing." He said, "Who did it?" She said, "I did." He was quiet a moment. He said, "Where did you learn to set iron?" She said, "A man at the boarding house in Ember Hollow let me watch when I was 12. After that, I practiced on whatever was broken. There was a lot that was broken." He said, "The forge takes a particular hand." She said, "I know." He said, "The solder." She said, "Your aunt kept it in her sewing basket." I don't know why. He almost smiled. She saw the corner of his mouth move and then go still, as if smiling were a habit he had given up and was not ready to take back. He said, "Eliza saved everything." She thought everything would matter eventually. She said she was right about the solder. He nodded. He hung his hat on the peg. He washed his hands. He said, over his shoulder, "The trough will hold longer than the rest of that line. We'll need to replace the pipe come spring." She said, "I noticed the union at the second joint is corroded through." He stopped with his hands in the basin. He turned his head and looked at her, and the look stayed on her, a beat longer than any look had stayed on her in her life. And he said, very quietly, "You noticed that?" She said, "I went down with a lantern after the trough filled. The joint sweats when the pressure rises." He was silent. Then he said, "You went down with a lantern after dark on land you don't know, with cattle on it, by yourself." She said, "The cattle know me now." He said, "Do they?" She said, "I've been bringing them salt." He stood at the basin with his hands dripping, and he looked at her across the kitchen, and she felt the look the way a person feels the first warm wind of a thaw, and she bent her head over the bread again, because she did not know what to do with her face. He said, after a moment, "Wren." She looked up. He said, "Thank you." 2 words, said the way he said everything, without ornament, and she felt them sit down in her chest like guests she did not know how to seat. She nodded. She said, "You're welcome." He dried his hands. He sat at the table. She brought him supper. They ate without talking, and the silence between them was not the silence of strangers any more, and she filed that away too, in the quiet room behind her ribs, with a little more care than usual. The next morning, Hollis Marin came up the road on a Tuesday, which was not his day, and he did not come alone. He brought with him a thin man in a black coat with a leather folio under his arm, and a deputy sheriff from Bell Creek with a tin star pinned crooked on his vest, and the 3 of them stood on the porch, and the thin man read out, in the dry voice of a man who reads such things for a living, that the Caldwell Ranch was in arrears on a private note held by the Bell Creek Bank in the amount of $1,412.60, and that the note had come due, and that the bank would, regrettably, be compelled to take action if the sum was not satisfied within 30 days. Caleb listened with his hat in his hand, and his face perfectly still. He did not ask to see the paper. He did not need to. He had known the day and the hour the note came due, and he had known, when he signed it 18 months ago, that he would not have the money when the day came, and he had known that Hollis Marin had known it too, and had counted on it, and had built the whole slow architecture of the last 2 years around that one Tuesday morning. He said, when the thin man had finished, "I'll have your answer by the end of the month." Hollis Marin smiled. He said, "I do hope you will, Mr. Caldwell. It pains me to see a family place go on the block. I would so much rather we came to an arrangement." Caleb said nothing. The deputy shifted his weight. The thin man closed the folio. They went down the steps and got into the buggy and drove away, and Caleb stood on the porch until the buggy was a black speck at the bottom of the long road, and then he came inside, and Wren, who had heard every word through the open window, was already pouring his coffee. He sat. He took the cup. He held it without drinking. He said, "After a while, you heard." She said, "I heard." He said, "There's no money." She said, "I know." He said, "I sold 30 head last fall to keep the men paid. I sold 40 more in the spring to fix the roof on the barn before the rains. I haven't been able to put weight back on the herd because the south pasture won't hold them through summer without the well, and the well won't hold without new pipe, and the pipe takes money I don't have, and Hollis Marin has known every one of those numbers since the day I signed his note, because Hollis Marin made sure of it." She said, "The porch post." He looked up. She said, There's a nail in the porch post by the railing that isn't a nail. There's a paper inside it with 3 numbers and a letter. I found it the second Thursday I was here. I think someone on this place is leaving him notes. I think he's been reading them every week when he comes up to make his offer. I think that's how he knows which questions to ask." Caleb set the cup down. He set it down very carefully, the way a man sets down a thing he is afraid he will throw. He said, "Show me." She showed him. They walked out together onto the porch in the late morning sun, and she pried the nail head out with her knife and tipped the folded square of paper into his palm, and he unfolded it and looked at it, and his jaw moved once, and he refolded it and put it back, and pressed the nail head back into the post, and said, very evenly, "Who?" She said, "I don't know yet, but the numbers on this one are different from the ones I saw 2 weeks ago. Whoever it is, they're updating it." Caleb was quiet a long moment. He said, "How many men have been on this porch in the last 2 weeks?" She said, 4 hands. Tobias, you, me, the cook from the bunkhouse twice, the boy from town who brought the mail on Friday, and Hollis Marin and his thin man and the deputy this morning." He said, "The boy from town." She said, "The boy from town didn't go near the post. He stood on the bottom step and handed up the mail and left. I watched." He said, "You watched?" She said, "I watch everyone. It's a habit." He looked at her. He said, "It's a useful one." He took his hat off the peg and put it on. He said, "Don't tell Tobias yet. Don't tell anyone. Just keep watching." She said, "I will." He said, "And Wren?" She waited. He said, "If you find out who it is, you come to me first. You don't go to him. You don't go to her. You come to me." She said, "I will." He went out. She stood on the porch a moment with her hand on the railing, and she felt the wood warm under her palm where the morning sun had been on it. And she thought about the 4 hands in the bunkhouse, and which of them had a reason, and which of them had a price. And she went back into the kitchen and put the bread in the oven, and began, in the quiet, steady way she did everything, to make a list in her head. The list took her 11 days to finish. In those 11 days, 3 things happened that mattered. The first was that the youngest of the 4 hands, a sandy-haired boy of 19 named Eli, who had a mother and a sister in town, and not much sense in his head, came up to the kitchen one evening for a bandage on a cut hand, and stayed at the table longer than the bandage required, and asked her, in a voice that was trying very hard to be casual, whether she had ever seen Mr. Caldwell's papers, the ones he kept in the desk in the front room, because he had heard Mr. Caldwell talking to Tobias about a deed, and he wondered, just out of curiosity, what an old deed looked like. Wren wrapped the bandage. She tied it neat. She said, "I've never been in Mr. Caldwell's desk." "I wouldn't know." Eli said, "Oh." He said, "Of course." He went away. She watched him go across the yard to the bunkhouse, and she saw him stop before he went in, and look up the road toward town for a long moment, and she filed Eli away in a particular slot in her head, and went on with supper. The second thing that happened was that a storm came down out of the high country on a Thursday night, faster than the sky had warned, and tore the sag on the east side of the main barn open, and dumped a foot of wet snow into the loft before any of them got to it. And Caleb and Tobias and the 3 older hands worked through the night by lantern light to save the hay, and Wren worked beside them, because no one had told her not to, and she had not asked. And by dawn, the 4 men were spent and shaking. And she was still going, hauling forkfuls of wet hay out through the gap and pitching it down to where it could be dried. And Tobias finally caught her by the elbow and said, "Girl, sit down before you fall down." And she sat down on a bale, and discovered that her hands had locked closed around the fork handle and would not open, and Caleb came over and crouched in front of her and worked her fingers loose one by one with a gentleness she hadn't known a man's hands could carry, and he did not say anything while he did it. But when her hands were free, he kept one of them in his a beat longer than he needed to, and then he let it go and stood up and said, "To all of them, go in and eat. I'll finish." Tobias said, "Like hell you will." The two older hands said nothing, but did not move. They finished together. When the sun came up over the broken roof, the hay was saved, the gap was tarped, and Wren was standing at the kitchen stove making eggs for 5 men, because the cook from the bunkhouse had slept through the storm, and she had decided, somewhere in the long blue hour before dawn, that she was tired of waiting for permission to feed the people she had worked beside all night. They ate at her table. Tobias said grace, which he hadn't done in her hearing before, and he said it short, and at the end of it he said, "And thanks for the girl, Lord, because we'd be standing in a wet barn arguing about it without her. Amen?" And the older hands said amen, and Caleb said amen. And Eli, who had come in last and sat at the end of the bench, said amen a beat late and did not lift his eyes from his plate. The third thing that happened was that on the 11th day, a Friday, Wren went down to the south pasture at first light with a bucket of salt, and found, by the trough she had patched, a set of boot prints in the soft ground that did not belong to any of the hands. She knew the hands' boots. She had cleaned mud off all of them at one time or another. These prints were narrower through the heel and squared off at the toe, the print of a town boot, not a work boot, and they came from the direction of the road and went to the trough and stood there a long time, judging by the depth, and then went around to the wellhead and stood there too, and then went back toward the road. She crouched and looked at the prints a long while. Then she stood up and walked the line of them back toward the road, and she found, 50 yards short of the road, where the prints met a second set, these ones the prints of a horse that had stood quietly cropping grass while its rider walked down to the trough and back. She memorized the shape of the horse's shoe. There was a notch in the off-hind, small but distinct, the kind of notch a smith puts in when he is reusing an old shoe and the metal has worn unevenly. She walked back to the house. She did not tell Caleb. Not yet. She wanted one more piece. She got it that afternoon. Hollis Marin came up the road on his Thursday day, a day late because the storm had washed out the lower crossing, and he came alone, and he tied his horse at the rail and walked up the steps and stood on the porch with his hat in his hand and waited for Caleb to come out, which Caleb did, after a moment, with his own hat in his hand and his face still. While they spoke, Wren, who had been told to stay out of sight and had every intention of obeying except in the particular, stood at the side window of the kitchen where she could see the rail, and she looked at Hollis Marin's horse, and she looked at the off-hind shoe, and she saw the notch. She did not breathe for a moment. Then she breathed, and she went back to her bread, and when Hollis Marin had refused his coffee and tipped his hat and gone back down the steps and mounted and ridden away, she came out onto the porch and stood beside Caleb in the long slant of afternoon light, and she said, "The boot prints at the trough this morning were his." Caleb did not turn his head. He said, "You're sure?" She said, "The shoe on his off-hind has a notch. The prints by the rail just now match the prints at the trough. He walked down there himself this week. He looked at the well. He looked at the patch. He's deciding what to break next." Caleb was quiet. Then he said, "The note in the post." She said, "Hasn't been updated this week." He said, then whoever's leaving them hasn't had anything new to leave, or hasn't had the chance. She said, "Eli asked me about the deed in your desk on Tuesday night." Caleb closed his eyes for the space of a breath. He opened them. He said, "Eli." She said, "His mother and his sister are in town. He's 19. He's not bad. He's bought." Caleb said, "By Hollis." She said, "Almost certainly." Caleb said, "All right." Wren said, "Don't fire him." Caleb turned his head, finally, and looked at her, and lifted that scarred eyebrow another half-inch. He said, "No." She said, "If you fire him, Hollis knows we know. If you keep him, we feed him what we want Hollis to read." Caleb looked at her a long moment. He said, "Where did you learn to think like that?" She said, "I grew up in a town where everybody had decided what I was before I opened my mouth. You learn to listen to what people think they know." He said, "Wren." She waited. He said, "You've been here 26 days. She said, "I've been counting too." He said, "It feels longer." She said, "In a good way or a bad way?" He said, "In the only way that matters." He put his hat back on. He went down the steps and across the yard to the barn, and she stood on the porch in the slant of light and felt the warm wood under her palm again, and thought very carefully about the difference between being useful and being wanted, and about the way the second one had always seemed, to her, like a country she would never have a visa for, and about the way Caleb Caldwell had just, without meaning to, handed her one at the door. She did not let herself believe it yet. She had her rules. The first rule was never trust kindness until it had been tested by inconvenience. The second rule was leave before you can be left. The third rule was keep the kettle packed. She went inside. She did not unpack the kettle. But that night, after supper, when Caleb had gone out to check the horses, and the kitchen was hers and the fire was low, she took the kettle down off the shelf where she had set it the first morning, and she filled it, and she set it on the stove, and she made herself a cup of tea, and she drank it, sitting at the long table by herself, and she thought about her mother, and she thought about the woman who had bought a kettle the year her daughter was born, so that her daughter would always be able to make her own tea anywhere in the world, and she thought, for the first time in a long time, that maybe her mother had not meant the kettle as a way of being never wholly without a home. Maybe her mother had meant the kettle as a way of carrying a home with you until you found the one you were meant to set it down in. She set the cup down. She looked at the kettle on the stove. She did not put it back on the shelf. She left it where it was. The next morning she began, in earnest, the work of catching Hollis Marin. She did it the way she did everything, quietly, in small, unrequested increments, while keeping the bread rising, and the floors swept and the men fed. She started by mapping the notes. Every Thursday afternoon, after Hollis Marin had come and gone, she walked out to the porch post, and pried the nail head loose and copied, in pencil, on a scrap of brown paper, whatever was written inside, and pressed the nail head back in. She kept the scraps in the tin box that had held her mother's hairpins, in the bottom of her carpet bag, in the sewing room. Under the floorboard she had found loose her first week, and had not mentioned to anyone. By the end of the second month, she had 8 notes. The numbers and letters, laid out in order, began to make a kind of sense. They were inventory. Head of cattle on hand, bales of hay in the loft, sacks of grain in the bin. The letter at the end was a code for condition, she thought. Good or fair or poor, Hollis Marin had been receiving, every week for at least 2 months, and probably much longer, a precise running tally of exactly how thin the Caldwell ranch was running, and he had been timing his pressure to the numbers. The week the hay count dropped below a certain figure, he had come up with the deputy. The week the cattle count dropped below another, he had raised the interest on the note. He was not guessing. He had never been guessing. She showed Caleb the scraps on a Sunday evening when the house was quiet and Tobias had gone to bed, and the hands were in the bunkhouse, and the fire was burning low, and the kettle on the stove was singing its small, steady song. He spread the scraps on the table and looked at them a long time. He said, "Finally, this is enough to ruin him in any honest court." She said, "Bell Creek doesn't have an honest court." He said, "No, but the territorial circuit judge comes through in 3 weeks. He's an old friend of my father's. He doesn't owe Hollis Marin anything." She said, 3 weeks is after the note comes due." He said, "I know." She said, "Then we need something else. Something that buys time." Caleb looked at her across the scraps. He said, "What are you thinking?" She said, "I'm thinking about Eli. I'm thinking about what we feed him this week. I'm thinking that if Hollis Marin believes, on Thursday, that there are twice as many cattle on this place as there actually are, and that a buyer from Cheyenne is coming on Saturday with cash in hand for the whole herd at top market, he will do one of 2 things. He will move up his timeline and try to take the place before the buyer arrives, in which case he overreaches, and we catch him in the overreach, or he will hesitate, because hesitation is what wealthy men do when they smell a better deal slipping by. And either way, we buy ourselves the 3 weeks we need until the circuit judge gets here." Caleb was quiet a long while. He turned one of the scraps in his fingers. He said, "You'd have Eli lie for us." She said, "I'd have Eli tell the truth he thinks he knows. There's a difference." He looked at her. He said, "Explain it." She said, "We don't tell Eli anything. We let him see what we want him to see. We move the herd. We bring the back 40 pairs up to the near pasture in plain view of the bunkhouse. We have Tobias ride into town on Wednesday and let it slip, casual, at the feed store, that a man from Cheyenne is coming Saturday. Eli will hear it inside an hour. He'll leave his note Wednesday night. Hollis will read it Thursday morning before he comes up. By the time he gets here, he'll be working off numbers that aren't real, and he'll move on a calendar that isn't real either." Caleb said, "And when he discovers the cattle aren't what the note said?" She said, "By then he'll have done something he can't take back." Caleb looked at her a long time across the table. He said, "You've been carrying this in your head for a week." She said, 11 days. He almost smiled again. The corner of his mouth moved, and then went still, but it had moved further this time, and she saw it, and she filed that away too. He said, "All right. We do it your way." She nodded. She gathered up the scraps and folded them back into the tin and put the tin in her apron pocket, and she stood up to put the kettle back on, and Caleb said, "Wren." She stopped. He said, "When this is over." She waited. He said, "When this is over, I want to ask you something, and I want you to know now that whatever you answer, you have a place here." The asking doesn't change that. She did not turn around. She kept her hands on the kettle, and she looked at the wall above the stove where a tin pie plate hung on a nail and caught the firelight, and she said, in a voice that came out steadier than she had any right to, "All right." He said, "All right." She put the kettle on. She did not turn around for a long minute because her face was doing something she was not ready for him to see. When she did turn around, he was already at the back door with his hat in his hand, and he gave her one quiet look and went out, and she stood in the warm kitchen with her hand on the stove and felt the night close around the house like a thing that meant her no harm. Wednesday came. Tobias rode into town with the wagon, ostensibly for nails and coffee, and stopped at the feed store and stood at the counter and complained, in his slow drawl, to anyone in earshot about how Caldwell was finally going to thin the herd proper because some fool from Cheyenne was coming Saturday with cash money and an appetite, and wasn't it a shame how a man would pay top dollar for stock he hadn't seen, and Tobias spit and shook his head and bought his nails and his coffee and rode home. By supper time, the story had crossed Bell Creek twice. By dusk it had reached the back room of the bank, where Hollis Marin took his evening whiskey alone. By full dark, Eli, who had been sent to town on a thin errand of his own, had heard it 3 times, and ridden back to the bunkhouse with it riding in his head like a coin he could not wait to spend. Wren, who had been watching the bunkhouse from the kitchen window, saw the lantern come on in the back of the bunkhouse a little after 10, and saw it go off again a quarter of an hour later, and saw a shape leave by the side door and cross the yard with the particular hunched walk of a young man, trying very hard not to be seen, and go up onto the porch and stand by the post a long moment, and bend and straighten, and come back down off the porch the same way, and go back across the yard, and slip back into the bunkhouse. She did not move from the window for another half-hour. Then she went out onto the porch in her stocking feet, pried the nail head loose with the tip of her knife, and lifted out the small folded square. The numbers on it were the ones she and Caleb had decided to feed him, and there was a new line under the numbers in pencil, in the same careful hand as before, that said, "Buyer from Cheyenne Saturday. Cash. Full herd." She pressed the nail head back in. She went inside. She put the knife on the table. She looked at Caleb, who had come out of the front room with his hat in his hand and a coat over his arm, because he had been waiting up too. And she said, "He wrote everything we told him to." Caleb said, "Eli." She said, "Eli." Caleb stood a moment. Then he said, "What do you want me to do with him?" She said, "Nothing. Not yet. When the judge comes, we put it to him plain. He's 19. He'll fold. He'll tell us how he was paid, and when and by whose hand, and that will be the rope we hang Marin with. Until then, he's our messenger. He doesn't know it. Let's keep it that way." Caleb hung his hat back on the peg. He said, "You frighten me sometimes." She said, "In a good way or a bad way?" He said, "In the only way that matters." She did not look at him when he said it. She put the kettle on. She did not need tea. She put it on anyway, because the sound of the kettle starting to sing was the sound her hands made when they did not know what else to do. Thursday morning, Hollis Marin came up the road, and he did not come alone. He brought, this time, the thin man with the folio, the deputy with the crooked star, and a 4th man Wren did not recognize, a heavy-set man in a brown coat with a face that had been broken in more than one fight, and a pair of small dark eyes that did not stop moving. The 4 of them got out of the buggy and the 2 saddle horses and climbed the porch steps, and Hollis Marin, instead of waiting for Caleb to come out, knocked on the door himself, 3 sharp raps, and called out, in a voice that carried, "Mr. Caldwell, a word, if you please." Caleb opened the door. He did not invite them in. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand and his face still, and he looked at Hollis Marin, and at the thin man, and at the deputy, and at the heavy-set man, and he said evenly, "Hollis." Hollis Marin smiled. He said, "I'll come to the point, Mr. Caldwell, because I respect your time. It has come to my attention that you are entertaining the prospect of selling your herd this Saturday to a party out of Cheyenne. I'm afraid I cannot permit that." Caleb said, "You cannot permit it." Hollis Marin said, "The note I hold against this place is secured, as you will recall, against the movable stock as well as the land. Any sale of the herd in advance of the note's satisfaction is a sale of collateral, which under the terms of our agreement requires my written consent, which I haven't given, and which I willn't give, because the proceeds of such a sale would, I fear, find their way into your pocket, and not mine. Mr. Vance here is a deputy. He is here to inform you officially that any movement of stock off this property between now and the note's due date will be considered an act of fraud and treated as such. Mr. Doyle is here on my behalf to ensure that no such movement takes place. He will be staying. Caleb's jaw moved once. He said, "On my land." Hollis Marin said, "In the road, Mr. Caldwell, which is public, with a clear view of every gate. He will be staying." Caleb looked at the heavyset man. The heavyset man looked back at him with the flat patience of a man who has stood in a great many roads on a great many people's behalf. Caleb said, "My answer is the same as it was." Hollis Marin said, "Your answer is no longer interesting to me, Mr. Caldwell. Your situation is, the note is due in 19 days. You will not satisfy it. When you do not, this place will become mine, and I will permit your hands a week to find other employment, and I will permit you the same courtesy. I am telling you this so that you do not labor under any misapprehension about how the next 19 days are going to unfold. Good morning." He tipped his hat. He turned. The four of them went down the steps and got back into the buggy and on to the saddle horses, and the heavy-set man peeled off and rode to the bottom of the long road and dismounted at the gate and tied his horse to the fence post and sat down on a stump with his back against the post and folded his arms and made it clear, with the whole weight of his settled body, that he had no intention of moving for the next 19 days, or any portion thereof. Caleb shut the door. He stood in the front room with his hand still on the latch. He said, without turning around, "Well." Wren, who had been standing in the kitchen doorway through the whole of it, said, "He moved faster than I thought." Caleb said, "He moved exactly as fast as you said he would. The difference is, he put a man at the gate." She said, "That's not a problem." He turned. He said, "It's not." She said, "The man at the gate watches the gate. The gate is one road in and one road out. There are 4 other ways off this place if you know the country, and 3 of them will take cattle." He looked at her. He said, "You've been walking the fence lines." She said, "I've been walking everything." He almost laughed. It came out as a breath and the smallest possible movement of his shoulders. But it was a laugh, and she heard it, and she filed it away with care, because she had learned, in the weeks she had been there, that Caleb Caldwell's laughs were a currency he did not spend often, and each one was worth keeping. He said, "All right, then we'll do this. We will not move the herd. The herd is the bait. We'll keep it where Doyle can see it from the road, and we'll let Marin sit on his haunches, watching it and grinding his teeth, and we will spend the 19 days getting ready for the circuit judge. We need every scrap of paper I have, every receipt, every ledger entry, every letter from the bank, every note he's ever sent me, and we need it organized in a way a judge can read in an hour, because that's all the time we'll get." She said, "I can do that." He said, "I know." He said it without thinking, the way a man says a thing he has known for a while, and then he heard himself say it, and his eyes moved on her face a half-second longer than usual, and he turned away to hang his hat back on the peg, as if the peg required all of his attention. She went back into the kitchen. She put the kettle on. She did not know why she kept putting the kettle on. She put it on anyway. The 19 days were the longest and shortest of her life. They were long because every morning began with the sight of Doyle at the gate, still and patient as a stone, and the slow knowledge that across the county Hollis Marin was tightening, in small, invisible ways, every other rope he had ever laid around the Caldwell place. The feed store stopped extending credit. The blacksmith in Bell Creek developed suddenly a backlog that meant he could not shoe Caldwell horses for at least a month. A wagon of supplies Caleb had paid for 2 weeks earlier was misplaced by the freight company and turned up, eventually, in a barn outside town, with the seals broken and half the flour gone. None of it killed them. All of it was meant to remind them, daily, who held the larger hand. They were short because Wren did not sleep more than 4 hours any of those 19 nights, and every waking hour was filled. She and Caleb worked at the long table in the front room after the men had gone to the bunkhouse, by the light of 2 lamps, sorting 8 years of paper into piles that made a story a stranger could follow. She wrote out, in her clean, even hand, a summary of each loan, each payment, each interest hike, each missed delivery, each suspicious coincidence. And beside each one, she pinned the original document, and beside each document she pinned, where she had it, a corroborating note, and at the back of the whole stack she pinned the 8 scraps of brown paper on which she had copied, in pencil, the contents of the porch post over 2 months. She built, in 19 nights, a case. Tobias, who had been told the bones of it on the 2nd night because Caleb had decided he had earned the knowing, took to coming up to the house after supper and sitting at the end of the table with a cup of coffee and watching her work and saying, every so often, "Girl, I have seen a lot of things in 61 years, but I have never seen a stack of paper become a noose this neat." She did not look up. She said, "It isn't a noose yet." He said, "It's getting there." On the 12th night, very late, with the lamps burning low and Tobias gone to bed and the house quiet, Caleb pushed back from the table and stood and walked to the window and looked out at the dark yard for a long time. And then he said, without turning, "Wren." She said, "Yes." He said, "When I asked the other night if I could ask you something when this was over." She set down her pen. She did not look up. She said, "Yes." He said, "I'm going to ask it now instead." She waited. He said, "Will you stay?" She was quiet. He said, "Not because I need a cook or a hand or a woman who can set iron and read a horse's shoe and outthink a banker. I have those things now, and I won't lose them whatever you say. I'm asking, will you stay because the house is warmer with you in it, and because I have, for 2 months, been trying to find a reason that isn't selfish to ask, and tonight I gave up looking. I'm asking selfish. Stay." She did not turn around either. She kept her hand on the pen, and she looked at the page in front of her, where the ink was still drying on the words she had just written, and she felt the room narrow around her the way rooms do when the most important sentence of your life has just been said in one. She said, finally, "I have a rule." He said, "I know you do." She said, "The rule is leave before you can be left." He said, "I know that one too." She said, "My mother had it. I learned it from her. I think she got it from hers. I don't know how far back it goes." He said, "Far enough." She said, "Yes." He said, "The rule isn't true here." She said, "I'm trying to decide that." He said, "Take your time." She turned around then, because she had to, because a question like that cannot be answered to a man's back. He was standing at the window with his hat in his hand and the lamp behind him, throwing his shadow long across the floor, and his face, when she looked at it, was the face of a man who had said a thing he had not been sure he would ever say, and was now waiting, with the particular stillness of a man who has learned to wait for weather, to see what came down out of it. She said, "When this is over." He said, "When this is over." she said. "Ask me again." He said, "I will." She turned back to the table. She picked up the pen. She wrote 3 more lines before her hand started to shake, and then she set the pen down and folded her hands in her lap and sat very still and let her hand finish shaking on its own time. And Caleb, who had seen it, did not come over and did not say anything, which was the right thing, which was the only thing. And after a minute, she picked the pen up again and went on. On the 18th day, the circuit judge came into Bell Creek on the noon stage, an old man with white hair and a face like good leather, and a pair of eyes that had been measuring men for 40 years, and were not in the habit of being fooled. His name was Judge Asa Holm, and he had known Caleb's father since both of them were young men with more nerve than sense, and he had come, as he came twice a year, to hold court in the small courthouse on the square and to clear the docket of whatever the territory had piled up since spring. Caleb rode in to meet him at the hotel that afternoon. He did not take Wren. He took the stack of paper, bound in twine, in a leather satchel that had been his father's. He came back at dusk with the satchel empty, and his face, for the first time in 2 months, set in something close to peace. He said, at the kitchen door, "He'll hear it Friday at 10. She said, "Will he be fair?" He said, "He will be exact." "With Holm, that's the same thing." She nodded. She brought him supper. He ate. He said, "Halfway through? Wren?" She said, "Yes." He said, the satchel was almost too heavy for one man to carry. He looked at her over the table. He said, "You did that?" She said, "We did that." He said, "No, I signed the notes. I let the place run thin. I let a man like Marin get his hand under my ribs. And I didn't see it because I was tired and proud and grieving, and the whole stack in that satchel exists because you came up that road with a kettle and a carpet bag and looked at the porch post and saw a nail that wasn't a nail. I want that said once between us. Plain. You did that." She did not answer for a moment. Then she said, "All right." He said, "All right." He finished his supper. He took his plate to the basin. He washed it. He put it on the rack. He hung the towel on the hook. He said, "At the door." "You ought to sleep tonight." She said, "I will." He said, "Do you mean it?" She said, "No." He nodded. He said, "Neither will I." He went out. She did not sleep. She sat at the long table, with the kettle singing low on the stove, and she went through, one more time, every page of the case she had built, looking for the seam she had missed, because there was always a seam, and a man like Hollis Marin would find it, if she had left one. She found near dawn one small thing she had not addressed, and she addressed it, and she pinned the new sheet into the satchel where it belonged, and then she put her head down on her arms on the table for what she promised herself would be 10 minutes, and woke up 2 hours later with the grey pre-dawn light at the window, and Caleb standing in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee, one for her and one for him, and a look on his face that she would, for the rest of her life, be unable to describe in any word that did the look justice. He set 1 cup in front of her. He sat down across from her with the other. He did not say anything. They drank their coffee in the quiet kitchen while the light came up, and outside in the yard the rooster started his small, disgruntled complaint, and somewhere down the road Doyle was waking up at his post by the gate, and somewhere in town Hollis Marin was putting on a clean shirt and a polished coat for what he believed was going to be the easiest morning of his year. And in the kitchen, Wren and Caleb drank their coffee and did not speak, and the kettle on the stove sang its small, steady song, and she thought, for the first time in her life, that perhaps the kettle had been a promise rather than a warning. They rode into Bell Creek that morning in the wagon, Caleb at the reins, Wren beside him on the bench, Tobias riding alongside on his old roan with the leather satchel strapped behind his saddle, because Caleb had said, before they left, that if anything happened to the wagon between the gate and the courthouse, the papers ought not to be in it. Doyle at the gate stood up from his stump as they approached. He did not move to stop them. He had been told to watch for cattle moving off the place, not for a wagon going to town, and even Hollis Marin had not thought to instruct him in the matter of paper. He watched them pass with his flat, patient eyes. And Wren, sitting straight on the bench beside Caleb with her hands folded in her lap and the kettle, for reasons she could not have explained even to herself, set on the floorboard between her feet, met his look as the wagon went by, and did not look away. The town was already filling when they came in. Court day brought people in from the outlying ranches and farms, men with business and men with curiosity, and a fair number of women with both. And by the time Caleb hitched the team at the rail in front of the courthouse, the square was thick with wagons and saddle horses and small clumps of talkers in hats, and word had gone around, the way word always went around in a place like Bell Creek, that the Caldwell matter would be heard at 10, and that Hollis Marin had been seen going up the courthouse steps at 9:15 with the thin man and a second lawyer brought up from Cheyenne for the occasion, which meant Hollis Marin expected a fight, which meant a fight was worth watching. Wren climbed down from the wagon. She smoothed her dress, which was the same dress she had walked the 6 miles in 2 months ago, washed twice since, and mended at the elbow, and she took the kettle off the floorboard and set it on the seat, because she was not going to carry a kettle into a courthouse, and she stood a moment with her hand on its handle, and then she let go of it and turned and walked beside Caleb up the steps. Tobias came behind with the satchel. People looked. A woman in a green hat near the corner of the building said something to the woman beside her, and the second woman covered her mouth with a gloved hand and laughed. And Wren heard the laugh and did not turn her head. She had been laughed at by better women and by worse. She climbed the steps. Inside, the courtroom was small and plain, with a railing across the front and a table on either side, and a high desk at the center, and the room smelled of pipe smoke and old wood and the cold iron of the stove in the corner. Hollis Marin sat at the right-hand table in a fresh coat, with the thin man on one side and the Cheyenne lawyer on the other, and he looked up when Caleb came in and gave Caleb a small civil nod, as if they were two gentlemen meeting at a public function, and his eyes moved past Caleb to Wren and stopped there a beat, and the beat was the first thing she had ever seen on Hollis Marin's face that was not entirely composed. He hadn't, she realized, accounted for her. He had heard, of course, that there was a woman at the Caldwell place. He had probably been told by Eli, in one of the small, careful notes, that the woman cooked and cleaned and worked the yard, and he had filed her away under household, which was a category he did not bother with. Seeing her walk into the courtroom beside Caleb with her chin level and her hands quiet, and a man like Tobias behind her, carrying a leather satchel that plainly contained more than a household required, Hollis Marin recalibrated. She watched him do it. It took perhaps 2 seconds. At the end of it, the civil nod was still on his face, but the thing behind his eyes had moved, and she filed that away too. Judge Holm came in at the stroke of 10. He was every bit as Caleb had described him, white-haired and leather-faced, and slow in his movements in a way that did not suggest weakness so much as a man who had decided, long ago, exactly how fast he needed to be and would not be hurried past it by anyone in any room. He sat. He looked at the docket. He looked at Hollis Marin. He looked at Caleb. He said, "The matter of Marin against Caldwell. Mr. Marin, you've filed for an order of attachment against the Caldwell Ranch in satisfaction of a note that comes due, by my reading, in 1 day's time." Hollis Marin stood. He said, "With respect, Your Honor, the note comes due tomorrow, and we are here in anticipation of certain irregularities that have come to our attention regarding the proposed disposition of secured collateral." Judge Holmes said, "Irregularities." Hollis Marin said, "We have reason to believe Mr. Caldwell intends to sell the secured herd to an out-of-territory buyer in advance of the note's maturity, without the written consent of the noteholder, which constitutes fraud under the terms of the security agreement." Judge Holmes said, "Do you have evidence of this intent?" Hollis Marin said, "We have credible report." Judge Holmes said, "From whom?" Hollis Marin paused. He said, "From sources I am not at liberty to name in open court without prejudicing future cooperation." Judge Holmes looked at him over the tops of his spectacles. He said, "Mr. Marin, in this courtroom you are either at liberty or you are not before me." "Which is it?" Hollis Marin said, "Your Honor." Judge Holmes said, "Sit down, Mr. Marin. Mr. Caldwell." Caleb stood. He said, "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to introduce a body of evidence pertaining to the conduct of the noteholder over the past 2 years. I'd like further to introduce, as part of that evidence, the testimony of a young man currently in my employ who has been, under duress and for payment, supplying Mr. Marin with weekly reports on the condition of my ranch by means of a concealed cache in the post of my front porch. And I'd like to introduce, finally, the woman who discovered that cache, who compiled the evidence I am about to present, and who has, in plain terms, saved my place. I'd ask the court's leave to let her speak to the documents, because she knows them better than I do." Judge Holmes looked at Caleb a long moment. He looked at Wren. He said, "Your name." She stood. She said, "Wren Halloran, Your Honor." He said, "You compiled this evidence." She said, "I did." He said, "Are you an attorney, Miss Halloran?" She said, "No, Your Honor." He said, "Are you a clerk?" She said, "No, Your Honor." He said, "What are you?" She said, "I work at the Caldwell Ranch." Judge Holmes looked at her over his spectacles. He said, "Come up here, Miss Halloran." She went up. Tobias came up behind her and set the satchel on the table at the front of the rail, and Wren opened it, and she took out, one at a time, the documents she had spent 19 nights organizing, and she laid them in order across the table in the way she had laid them out 100 times in her head, and she began to speak. She spoke quietly. She did not raise her voice once. She walked Judge Holmes through the original note, the schedule of payments, the 3 interest hikes that had been imposed under clauses Hollis Marin had inserted in language the average rancher would not have known to read, the misplaced freight wagon, the credit withdrawals at the feed store, the blacksmith's sudden backlog, the loss of the south pasture, well to a slow corrosion that had been, she said, accelerated by a hand that had loosened a particular union by means of a wrench applied in the wrong direction at a depth that suggested a man who knew what he was doing. She laid out the boot prints she had found by the trough. She laid out the notch in the off-hind shoe of Hollis Marin's horse. She laid out, last, the 8 scraps of brown paper on which she had copied the contents of the porch post, and beside them the original of the most recent note, which she had retrieved from the post that morning before dawn and not replaced, and which she now unfolded and laid flat in front of the judge, and she said, "Your Honor, this note is in the hand of Eli Pearson, who is 19 years old and works on the Caldwell place, and who can be called, and who, I believe, will tell the court without elaboration who paid him and when and how much." The Cheyenne lawyer was on his feet. He said, "Your Honor, this is hearsay. This is unsubstantiated. This is—" Judge Holmes said, "Sit down." The Cheyenne lawyer sat down. Judge Holm picked up the most recent note. He read it. He picked up the scraps. He read them. He looked at the boot print sketches Wren had made on a clean sheet of paper, traced to scale with a piece of charcoal and a measuring string. He looked at the receipts for the freight wagon. He looked at the letter from the blacksmith's wife, which Wren had thought to obtain on a Tuesday 3 weeks ago, when she had ridden into town with Tobias for nails, and which stated in the blacksmith's wife's own hand that her husband had been told by Mr. Marin's man that there would be additional business at the bank's livery if Caldwell horses were not, for the foreseeable future, a priority. He looked finally at Wren. He said, "Miss Halloran, where did you learn to put a case together?" She said, "I didn't, Your Honor. I just laid out what was true in the order it happened." He looked at her a moment longer. He said, "That is what putting a case together is." He turned to Hollis Marin. He said, "Mr. Marin, I am going to call Mr. Pearson now. If Mr. Pearson tells me what Miss Halloran says he will tell me, I am going to set aside your note as procured and maintained by fraudulent practice. I am going to refer the matter of the Loosened Well Union and the freight tampering to the Territorial Marshal for investigation as criminal conduct, and I am going to recommend to the Territorial Banking Commissioner that your charter be reviewed. If Mr. Pearson tells me something different, I will hear you. Do you wish to be heard now, Mr. Marin, before I call him?" Hollis Marin stood up. The civil composure on his face was still there, but it had become a thinner thing, stretched over something underneath that was no longer civil and no longer composed. He said, "Your Honor, this is the testimony of a hired boy and a woman of no particular standing against the word of a chartered banker and 2 members of the bar. I would urge the court to consider the source." Judge Holm said, "I have considered it, Mr. Marin. Sit down." He sat. Eli was called. He came in from the back of the room where he had been sitting beside one of the older hands, his sandy hair flat against his head with sweat, his face the color of paper, his hands twisted together in front of him so tight the knuckles had gone white. He had been told that morning, by Caleb himself, in the yard before they left, that he was going to be called, and that he had a choice to make, and that the choice was his. And that whichever way he went, Caleb would not put a hand on him, but that the truth was the only door out of the room he was standing in. Eli had cried for a minute, standing there in the yard. Then he had wiped his face and nodded and said, "All right, Mr. Caldwell," and he had ridden into town in the back of the wagon with the older hand beside him, and he had sat at the back of the courtroom through the whole of Wren's presentation. And now he stood up before Judge Holm with his hands shaking, and he told the truth. He told it in pieces, in a voice that broke twice and steadied each time. And the truth he told was that Hollis Marin had come to him in the back of the feed store one afternoon in early spring, when Eli's mother had been sick, and the doctor's bill had been more than a hand's wages would cover, and had offered him $5 a week to leave a small note once a week in a hole that had been drilled in the porch post of the Caldwell ranch, and that the note was to contain a count of cattle, hay and grain, and a single letter for condition, and that Eli had done so for 19 weeks, and that the most recent note he had left had contained a line about a buyer from Cheyenne, which he had heard at the feed store, and which he had been told by Mr. Marin himself in a letter the week before, to include any rumor of sale that crossed his hearing. He produced from his shirt pocket the letter. It was in Hollis Marin's hand. It was signed with Hollis Marin's initials. He gave it to the bailiff, who gave it to the judge. Judge Holm read it. He set it down on top of the other papers. He took his spectacles off. He folded them. He laid them on the desk in front of him. He looked at Hollis Marin for a long, quiet moment, and Hollis Marin, for the first time since Wren had laid eyes on him, did not meet the look. Judge Holmes said, "Mr. Marin, the note you hold against the Caldwell Ranch is set aside, in full, as procured and maintained by fraudulent practice. You will satisfy, from the assets of the Bell Creek Bank, the cost of repair to the South Pasture well, the value of the goods lost in the freight tampering, and the loss of business sustained by Mr. Caldwell as a consequence of your interference with the blacksmith and the feed store, in amounts to be determined at a hearing I will schedule before I leave this town. The matter of the loosened union and the freight wagon is referred this morning to the territorial marshal. The matter of your charter is referred this afternoon to the banking commissioner. Mr. Pearson, you will remain in town until I have spoken with you further. Mr. Caldwell, this court owes you an apology on behalf of every honest institution in this territory that allowed a man like Mr. Marin to operate inside its walls. Miss Halloran." Wren looked at him. He said, "You have done a piece of work today that most men in this room couldn't have done with a year and a library. I would be obliged if you would consider, when you have time, whether you might want to come and sit for the territorial bar examination. We do not have many women at it. We could use one who lays out what is true in the order it happened." She did not answer. She did not, in truth, know how. He said, "Court is adjourned." The room emptied slowly. People did not leave the way they had come in. They left in small, quiet clusters, with their hats in their hands, and several of them, on the way out, stopped at the rail and said a word to Caleb, which was a word Caleb had not heard from any of them in a long time, and a few of them, the woman in the green hat among them, came across the room to where Wren was gathering the papers back into the satchel, and the woman in the green hat stood at the table with her gloved hands folded over her reticule and said, "Miss Halloran, I owe you an apology. I laughed at you on the steps this morning. I should not have. I am sorry." Wren straightened. She looked at the woman. She said evenly, "Thank you for saying so." She did not say more. She had learned, somewhere in the last 2 months, that when a person who had wronged you came and said the wronging out loud, the right thing to do was to take the saying and not weaponize it, and not pretend it had not cost you anything, and that this was a balance hard to strike. And she struck it the best she could, and went back to her papers, and the woman in the green hat nodded and went away, and the room kept emptying. Hollis Marin did not come over. He left through a side door with the thin man on one side and the Cheyenne lawyer on the other, and the deputy with the crooked star, who had been standing at the back of the room through the whole of it, made no move to accompany him, and Wren noticed that, and filed it away, because it told her the deputy had read the room and had decided which way the wind was now blowing, which meant Hollis Marin had lost a thing in that courtroom that was not on any of the judge's lists, which was the assumption that the men he had bought would stay bought past the moment the buying stopped being safe. They walked out of the courthouse into the noon light. The square was still full. The talkers in hats had become talkers with news, and the news had spread, in the slow, accurate way news spread on court day, from one cluster to the next, and the look of the square when Caleb and Wren and Tobias came out at the top of the steps was not the look it had been when they had gone in. Men touched the brims of their hats. A rancher Wren had never seen before crossed the square and shook Caleb's hand and said, "Caldwell, I am glad." A woman with a baby on her hip nodded to Wren as she passed, and there was nothing in the nod that was condescending, and Wren took the nod and folded it carefully into the same place she had folded everything else that morning. They got into the wagon. Tobias strapped the satchel behind his saddle. Caleb took the reins. Wren picked up the kettle off the seat and held it in her lap. They drove home. They did not speak for the first mile. Then Caleb said, without looking at her, "You didn't tell me Judge Holm was going to offer you the bar." She said, "I didn't know he was." He said, "Would you do it?" She said, "I don't know." He said, "You'd be good at it." She said, "I'd be far away at it." He was quiet a moment. He said, "The territorial seat is 2 days' ride." She said, "I know." He said, "You could do both?" She said, "Could I?" He said, "I think you could do anything you set your hand to." She looked at the road. She said, "I'd like to think about it." He said, "Take all the time you want." She nodded. They drove. At the gate, Doyle was gone. The stump was empty. His horse was not at the post. Word had come down ahead of them, in the way word came down in the country. And Doyle, who had been paid by the day and not the principal, had folded his stool and ridden away to whatever next road his employer would point him at, and the gate stood open, which it had not stood since the day Hollis Marin had put a man at it, and Caleb drove the wagon through without slowing, and Wren felt, as they crossed the cattle guard, a small loosening in her chest that she hadn't known was tight. They came up the long road to the house. The yard was empty in the noon sun. The porch was as it had been that morning. The nail in the post was still there, because she had not replaced it after she pulled it for the last time. But the hole in the post was a hole now, and not a mouth. And the porch, when she climbed down off the wagon and stood looking at it, looked like a porch and not a place where something had been listening. Caleb unhitched the team. Tobias took the satchel into the house. Wren stood in the yard with the kettle still in her hand and looked at the porch a long moment, and then she walked up the steps and crossed the boards and stopped in front of the post where the hole was. And she set the kettle down on the railing, and she took her folding knife out of her apron pocket, and she opened it. She did not pry anything. There was nothing left to pry. She slid the tip of the blade into the hole, gentle as a thread, and worked it in to the depth of her finger. And then she drew it out, and the blade came out clean, with nothing on it, and she folded the knife shut and put it back in her pocket, and looked at the small dark eye of the hole in the post, and thought, for the first time, that she ought to plug it. Not seal it, because the post would weather better with a little air in the wood. Plug it with a peg of clean cedar, sanded flush, sealed with a touch of wax. A thing closed properly, the way a thing ought to be closed when it had been used for a purpose that was finished. She would do that in the morning. She picked the kettle up. She went inside. The house was quiet in the noon light, with the front door standing open behind her, and a thin breeze moving through it into the front room and out the kitchen door at the back, and the air smelled of stone and wood smoke, and the cold edge of the coffee Caleb had set on the stove before they left, which had cooked down to a black syrup at the bottom of the pot and would have to be poured out. She poured it out. She rinsed the pot. She filled the kettle from the basin and set it on the stove and lit the fire under it. And she stood in the kitchen with her hands flat on the edge of the table, and she waited for the kettle to start singing, because she did not know, in that moment, what else she was supposed to do with her hands, or her body, or her life, now that the thing that had taken up every waking minute of the last 2 months was finished. Caleb came in through the kitchen door behind her, with the smell of the team still on him. He hung his hat on the peg. He washed his hands at the basin. He did not say anything. He sat at the long table. She brought him a cup of coffee from the second pot, which had been on the stove 10 minutes, and was hot and bitter and exactly right, and she set it in front of him, and she sat down across from him with her own, and they drank their coffee in the kitchen, with the breeze moving through the house, and outside in the yard, Tobias was doing something with the wagon that involved the slow, patient cursing of a man who had decided to take his own time about it. After a while, Caleb said, "I want to say a thing, and I want to say it before the day gets any older and we lose the room for it." She said, "All right." He said, "I asked you the other night if you would stay. I told you the asking was selfish, and I meant it. I want to ask it now in a different way, because the situation has changed, and you ought to be asked the question that fits the situation you are in, not the one you were in a week ago." She set her coffee down. He said, "A week ago you had 3 weeks of work in front of you, and nowhere else in the world to be. Today you have a place on this ranch as long as you want it. You have a standing invitation from the territorial bench to sit for the bar. You have, I would guess, an offer or two coming from people in town who watched what you did this morning, and you have the rest of your life in front of you to spend on any of those things or on none of them. I am not asking you any more whether you will stay because you have nowhere else to go. I am asking you whether you will stay because you want to. And I am asking it knowing the answer might be no, or might be not yet, or might be I need a year first, or might be I will sit for the bar and ride home on weekends, or might be I will stay and never ride farther than the gate. Any of those answers is a real answer, and I will take it as one." She did not speak for a moment. She was looking at her hands on the table, the calluses at the base of each finger, the small white scar across the back of her right thumb where the trough iron had bitten her 2 months ago when she was setting it hot. She said, finally, "You asked me the other night, and I said when this was over, ask me again." He said, "This is me asking." She said, "I know." She said, "I have spent my whole life with a rule that said, leave before you can be left. I told you that." He said, "You did." She said, "The rule was true where I came from. It kept me alive. It is not true here. I have known it was not true here for at least a month, and I have been carrying it anyway, because I didn't know what to do with my hands if I set it down." He was quiet. She said, "I am going to set it down. I am setting it down now." He did not move. She said, "I will stay. I will stay because the house is warmer with me in it, and because it is warmer with you in it too, and because I haven't. In all the years I have been alive, sat in a room with another person, and felt my shoulders drop the way they drop when you come in through the kitchen door, and because I'm tired of running from a thing I was never going to be caught by anyway. I will stay." He let out a breath he had, she realized, been holding through her whole answer. He set his coffee down. He said, "Wren." She said, "Yes." He said, "I would like to sit for a minute and just know that." She said, "All right." They sat. The kettle on the stove came to a slow boil and started to sing, the small, steady song it had sung in her mother's kitchen and in the boarding house and in the train car and on the porch of the Caldwell Ranch on her first morning, and she listened to it sing, and she did not get up to take it off, because the singing was the right sound for the room, and Caleb did not get up to take it off either, and after a while the kettle quieted on its own, the water settling back from the boil into a low hum, and the kitchen went quiet around them, and the breeze moved through the house, and somewhere out in the yard Tobias finished with the wagon and went off toward the barn, whistling something tuneless and content. Caleb said, after a long while, about the bar. She said, "I am going to sit for it." He nodded. He said, "Good." She said, "I am going to sit for it, because Judge Holm was right that the territory could use one, and because I would like, for the rest of my life, to be able to walk into a room like that one this morning and lay out what is true in the order it happened, and I would like to do it for people who do not have a Caleb Caldwell to do it for them." He looked at her across the table. He said, "That is a thing worth doing." She said, "I will ride the 2 days to the seat when I need to, and I will come home when I am done." He said, "Home?" She said, "Yes." He said, "All right." He said it the way he said everything, without ornament, and she felt the 2 words sit down in her chest beside the 2 he had said the night of the trough, and she thought there was room for a great many such pairs in the place behind her ribs, and that she might, with time and care, learn to seat them all. They finished their coffee. He stood. He took both cups to the basin and rinsed them and set them on the rack, and he hung the towel on the hook, and he turned in the doorway and said, "I am going to ride out to the south pasture and look at the well in the daylight. Will you come?" She said, "Give me a minute." He said, "Take 10. He went out. She sat at the table a minute longer with her hands flat on the wood, and then she stood up, and she took her shawl from the peg by the back door, and she walked through the front room to the front door and out onto the porch, and she stood a moment looking at the post, and she said, out loud, to no one, "You are finished." The post did not answer. She had not expected it to. She walked down the steps and across the yard to where Caleb was tightening the cinch on the bay he rode, and she swung up onto the grey mare he had been letting her ride for the last 3 weeks, the mare who knew her now and turned her ear back to listen for her voice, the way the cattle had begun to turn their heads when she walked among them with the salt, and she rode beside him down through the near pasture toward the south, and the noon light lay on the grass the colour of old gold, and a hawk turned somewhere very high above them, and Caleb, who had been quiet for the first half-mile, said without looking at her, "The well?" She said, "Yes." He said, "When we replace the pipe, I would like you to lay out the line. You see the country better than I do." She said, "All right." He said, "And the barn roof?" She said, "I have a thought about the barn roof." He said, "I knew you would." They rode. They came to the south pasture, and the trough and the wellhead, and they dismounted, and Caleb went down on one knee beside the union she had named the night she went down with the lantern, and he ran his fingers along it the way she had run hers, and he said, "You were right about which way the wrench had turned." She said, "I know." He said, "You didn't say so this morning." She said, "I didn't need to." The judge would have heard it from the marshal soon enough. He looked up at her from where he knelt. He said, "You let me have that one." She said, "I let the marshal have it." There is a difference. He almost laughed again, the breath and the shoulders, and she filed it away with the others, and she thought, with some surprise, that she had begun to collect his laughs the way other women collected ribbons or letters, and that she did not feel foolish about the collecting, and that she was going to keep doing it for as long as he kept producing them, which she suspected would be a long time, because the laughs were coming a little easier already, and the day was barely half over. They stayed at the south pasture an hour. They walked the line of the old pipe from the well to the trough, and Wren marked, with small stones, where the new line ought to run to take advantage of a fall in the ground she had noticed on her second week, and Caleb followed her marks and nodded at each one, and at the end he said, "This is a better line than the one we have." She said, "The man who put the first one in was in a hurry." He said, "The man who put the first one in was my father, and he was in a hurry every day of his life. And you have just paid him a compliment he would have appreciated, because he knew his own faults better than anyone." She looked at him. She said, "I would have liked to meet him." He said, "He would have liked you. He would have told you so within 10 minutes, because he never could keep anything in. which is the only way in which he and I do not resemble each other." She smiled. He saw her smile. He looked at her a beat longer than he needed to, and then he turned away to gather the reins of the bay, and she gathered the reins of the grey mare, and they mounted and rode back toward the house in the long afternoon light, and the hawk that had been turning above them at noon was gone now, and a small wind had come up out of the west and was moving the grass in long pale waves, and she rode beside him at a walk and didn't feel, as she had felt every other time she had ridden anywhere in her life, that she ought to be hurrying toward something or away from it. She was where she was supposed to be. She was riding home. They came up to the house at dusk. Tobias had supper started in the kitchen, which was a thing he had never done in her hearing, and which, when she came through the door, he denied with the dignity of a man caught in an act of tenderness, saying gruffly that the stove had needed clearing, and the pot had needed something in it, and one thing had led to another, and it was not, by any measure he would accept, supper. She said, "Of course not." He said, "Of course not." She took over the pot. He sat at the end of the table with his coffee and watched her work and said, after a while, "The boy." She said, "Eli." He said, "What becomes of him?" She said, "That depends on him. Judge Holm will hold him a few days. The marshal will want to know what he knows. After that, he goes home to his mother and his sister and decides what kind of man he is going to be. He is 19. There is time." Tobias said, "You are softer on him than I would be." She said, "I am not soft on him. I am exact. He did the thing for $5 a week because his mother was sick. He told the truth this morning because he was given the chance to. A man who can be bought for $5 can also be redeemed for less, if the redemption is offered in time. I would rather we offered it." Tobias said, "You sound like Eliza." She set the spoon down. She said, "Do I?" He said, "You do." She had been told, twice in her life, that she resembled a woman she had never met, and both times the telling had come from a man who had loved that woman, and she did not know what to do with the telling either time, except to take it and put it in the room behind her ribs with the rest of what she was learning to keep. And so she took this one and put it there, and she picked the spoon up and went back to the pot. And Tobias drank his coffee and did not press her, because Tobias, for all the gruffness, had the sense of a man who had lived alongside women his whole life, and knew, when a thing had been said, that needed sitting with, rather than answering. Caleb came in. He hung his hat. He washed his hands. He sat at his place. They ate, the three of them, at the long table, with the lamp lit because the evenings were turning early, and the pot was good, and the bread was good, and the coffee was the third pot and the best of the day, and they did not, any of them, speak much, because the day had used up most of their words, and what was left was the comfortable quiet of three people who had finished a hard thing together and did not need to keep saying so to each other to know it was true. After supper, Tobias went off to the bunkhouse, with a look at Caleb that was not a wink and not a smile, and was somehow both, and Caleb and Wren cleared the table together, the way they had cleared it most nights for the last 2 months, and when the dishes were done and the towel was hung, and the kitchen was put back the way she liked it, Caleb said, "Will you come out a minute?" She said, "All right." They went out the back door and stood on the small back porch that looked east over the pasture and the far line of cottonwoods along the creek, and the moon was up, a thin moon, and the stars were coming out behind it, and the air was cold the way the air at altitude is always cold once the sun is down, and Caleb did not say anything for a long moment. And then he reached into his coat pocket and took out a small flat thing wrapped in a square of cloth, and he held it out to her. She took it. She unwrapped it. It was a key. It was an old key, brass, worn smooth at the bow from a great many hands over a great many years, and it was heavy in her palm in a way that small things are heavy when they have meant something to people. She looked at it. She looked at him. He said, "The front door." She said, "You don't lock the front door." He said, "I haven't in 8 years. My father locked it. He kept the key on a nail beside the bed. When he died, I took it down and put it in a drawer and haven't had it in my hand since. I would like you to have it." She closed her fingers around the key. She did not, for a moment, trust her voice. He said, "It is not a request that you lock the door. The door can stay open as long as you want it open. It is only that this place is yours now as much as mine, and a person who lives in a place ought to hold the key to it, whether she uses it or not." She said, "Caleb." He said, "Yes." She said, "I have never held a key to anywhere I lived." He said, "You do now." She closed her hand tighter around the key. She felt the cold brass warm against her palm. She felt, behind her ribs, the room she had been carrying her whole life rearrange itself one more time, very gently, to make space for a thing she had not expected to be carrying. She put the key in the pocket of her apron, where her folding knife lived, and she said, "Thank you." He said, "You are welcome." They stood on the back porch a little longer. The thin moon climbed. A coyote called somewhere out past the cottonwoods, and another answered it from the south, and the cattle in the near pasture made the small settling sounds that cattle make when they have decided the night is going to be safe. And Wren stood beside Caleb with her hand in her pocket, on the key, and her shoulder almost touching his shoulder, and she thought about the long road from Ember Hollow, and the depot at Bell Creek, and the 6 miles she had walked with the kettle in her hand, and the porch boards under her boots that first afternoon, and the door opening, and the man on the other side of it who had looked at her and not laughed. He had not laughed then. He was not laughing now. He had, in all the time she had known him, been exactly the man he had seemed to be that first afternoon, which was a thing she had not, in her experience, found often in men or in anyone. And she had been wrong about that in advance, the way she had been wrong about so many things in advance, because she had been raised in a school that taught you to be wrong in advance in order to be safe, and the school had been wrong about that too. She had been wrong about a great many things. She had been wrong about them from the beginning. She turned her head a little and looked at his profile in the thin moonlight, the line of his jaw, the small scar through his eyebrow that lifted it permanently into a question, and she said softly, "Can I ask you something?" He said, "Anything." She said, "The first morning, when I knocked. Why did you open the door?" He was quiet a moment. He said, "Because Eliza said you might come." She said, "You could have opened it and turned me around. You could have given me a meal and a bed for a night and put me on a wagon back to Bell Creek in the morning." Most men would have. He said, "I know." She said, "Why didn't you?" He said, "Because you knocked 3 times. She looked at him. He said, "The men who came to the door looking for work knocked once, hard, and waited. The men who came to the door selling something knocked twice, soft, and started talking before the door was open. The men who came to the door wanting trouble didn't knock at all. You knocked 3 times even, and you waited, and you did not say anything when I opened it, and you let me look at you as long as I needed to look. I had never had anyone come to that door who knocked like that. I thought, before I had any other thought, that whoever you were, you had come a long way to get to the door, and you were not going to make it easy for me to send you back. So I let you in to find out who you were." She said, "That was all." He said, "That was all, the first afternoon. The rest of it I learned over time." She said, "What did you learn?" He said, "That you knocked the way you knocked because you had been turned away from a great many doors, and you had decided, somewhere on the road, that you were going to give this one its 3 chances, and then go. And that the 3 chances were not for me. They were for you, so you could say afterward that you had given it the asking it deserved." She did not answer. He said, "I learned that you do not show what hurts. I learned that you do not ask for what you need. I learned that you will work yourself into the ground for a place that has not yet decided whether to keep you, because work is the only language you have ever been allowed to speak. I learned that you are afraid of being seen, and you are more afraid of not being seen, and you do not know yet which is the larger fear." She said very quietly, "Caleb." He said, "I am not done." She waited. He said, "I learned that you are the most competent person I have ever met, and that the competence is not the most interesting thing about you. The most interesting thing about you is